Hey everyone, my name is Marcus Hartwig. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Vectra AI. And today we are going to talk about how NDR secures your accelerated cloud adoption. With me today, I'm incredibly lucky to have Jon Oltsik. He's the Senior Principal Analyst and an ESG Fellow. Jon is an ESG Fellow and the founder of the firm Security Service. With over 30 years of technology industry experience, Jon is widely recognized as an expert in all aspects of cybersecurity and often called upon to help customers understand a CISO's perspective and strategies. And we are incredibly lucky to have Jon with us today. So I'm going to start to hand this off to Jon, and hopefully we can have a very interesting discussion about this subject.
Thank you, Marcus. Hello, everyone. And I'm going to talk about security operations trends, but as Marcus mentioned, really in the context of the proliferation of cloud delivered services. So if you go on to the next slide, this is my agenda for today. I'm going to talk about threat detection and response status. It's a high priority in organizations, but it's very challenging. We'll talk about those challenges. I'll talk about kind of an associated trend, security telemetry. It's growing. It's being retained for longer periods of time, makes it challenging to get through all of it, and we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about emerging solutions because we are seeing trends, and I think, certainly I have data to speak to that, but I know Vectra can as well. The bigger truth is my summary and conclusion. So if you go to the next slide, here's what we see today, and we ask this question quite a bit. The question is, how would you compare threat detection and response today to how it was 2 years ago? And if you can click once more, what we see is 76% of the security professionals that we surveyed say that threat detection and response is either much more difficult today than it was 2 years ago, or it's somewhat more difficult today than it was 2 years ago. And that is a consistent trend, is that things in security grow more and more complicated, more and more difficult over time. So just over three quarters said that things are more difficult with threat detection and response. So we asked that population to give us the primary reasons why they believe threat detection and response is harder. And here's the data that we saw on the right side. So over a third, 34% said the volume and sophistication of threats has increased. And this is appropriate for Vectra, which talks about becoming the threat-driven detection and response engine. So it's really aligned with what we're talking about today and the right vendor to talk to about it. The threat detection and response workload has increased 17%. Now, we have humans in the SOC, they have a job to do, but we have to supplement what they're doing because the scale of this job, the depth of this job and scope is just too much. So we have to think about things like automation, we have to think about advanced analytics, we have to think about services. The attack surface has grown 16%. So the kill chain has extended across the attack surface and into the cloud. And so we have to be sensitive to this attack surface growth, but really understand the new types of attacks. So the data is moving, one of the things we're seeing is that data is moving from inside the network to outside into a hybrid architecture. And Marcus, I know that you've recently done some research around the healthcare industry that may be really a parallel to what I'm talking about. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for bringing it up, Jon. We recently released our report on what we see in trends of healthcare, because there's been a lot of news talking about how healthcare have suffered a wide array of attacks and breaches in response to the current situation that they're under. And we can fortunately say that that's not the data that we've seen with all of our healthcare customers, but we are definitely confirming what you're saying here as well, Jon, that these threats have increased and that there's been an accelerated adoption of cloud metric or cloud workloads for these healthcare companies, and that of course has put them under a large amount of new attacks and different attacks than they are used to in a short amount of time.
Yeah, and I know healthcare organizations are big adopters of cloud services and SaaS because their mission is healthcare, healing patients, not IT and technologies. They tend to be understaffed, so that when the data moves off-site, it's vulnerable.
And I think especially if you move all that data offsite in a short amount of time as well, you might have a little bit of more lax security think around it if you just need to get things going as quickly as possible, and maybe you don't test and audit each and every system that you migrate, or there's a lot of misconfigurations and things like that as well, I suppose.
Oh, absolutely. And if you go to the next slide, this slide puts that 16% attack surface growth in context.
Just a quick question when I'm looking at this slide, Jon. From the data that you've seen, have you seen an increase in staff as well, security staff? If the workload is going up, are organizations appropriately staffing this up as well, or is just the same amount of people have more stuff to deal with at this point?
You are touching on one of my passions here. One issue that I follow with great consistency and great interest is the cybersecurity skills shortage. So to answer your question, yes, there is a slight increase in headcount, but most organizations find it very difficult to recruit and hire people. So the skill shortage is impacting people, impacting organizations, and it's really important to note that when we talk about the skill shortage, it doesn't just mean I have a shortage of people in my staff. It also means that I may not have the right skills. And what we've seen in recent research, Marcus, is that these problems are exacerbated by the work from home trend because of COVID-19. So we're putting more work on the security staff, and it's harder to find and recruit people. So yeah, this is a problem that's not going away. So workload's increasing, staff is not increasing proportionally.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, now if you can go to the next slide. So this puts the attack surface in context. 82% of organizations that we surveyed are using software as a service, 72% infrastructure as a service, 67% PaaS, platform as a service. Only 4% said we do not currently use any public cloud service. So a couple of editorial comments from me, and then Marcus, I'd love your opinion. So one is, while there's growth in all of the cloud platforms here, there remains a very robust hybrid architecture. So this doesn't mean that all the dollars are going to the cloud. There are certainly probably, or our research indicates a preponderance of dollars are going to the cloud, but there's still dollars on premise. There's still regulatory reasons why you keep data and applications on premise. So everything is moving back and forth, which creates a real challenge for security people. Second point is, as things move to the cloud, we have to know new APIs as data sources. We have to know the identity of privileged account or administrator accounts, understand what they're doing, because there are a lot of attacks that do things like credential harvesting. We have to look at campaigns that cross into the cloud and threat intelligence. We have to map that to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and there's MITRE ATT&CK framework for cloud. And one other comment I'll make specifically, Marcus, is just before I got on this call to do this webinar, I was reading, and I think it was the Secret Service, but it may have been the FBI, put out a warning about new attacks on MSPs, so managed service providers, which could be MSSPs, managed security service providers, who basically have the keys to the kingdom. You know, you trust them as your third-party outsourcer for managed services for IT, so they have access to all your systems. So that's a pretty scary thing. And I know you have seen some additional types of attacks on SaaS and infrastructure as a service as well.
Yeah, so of course, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing as well are the what we call the control plane types of attacks. So you're sort of moving out from the protected bubble of the IaaS sort of cloud networks and then moving towards the control plane and are just able to leverage way more sophisticated attacks at a completely different scale there as well, and really get to those misconfigured stuff and things that aren't monitored in the same way from that side of the house. So yeah, definitely the attacks are definitely changing, and in the cloud for sure, as from anything we've seen before. And I'd like to add that this is fairly new ground for most people involved as well, and that even goes for the attackers, right? So they're sort of figuring out this as they go as well. So there's a lot of new style and new type of attacks, and I know that even traditional frameworks and things where we leverage are scrambling to sort of map to this. For example, the MITRE ATT&CK framework they're spinning up separate ones for cloud and specifically for different SaaS applications like Office 365, right? Because there's so much stuff going on here, and people are figuring it out as they go. Now, Jon, would you say that these sort of, based on the numbers that you've seen, are these three buckets, the PaaS, IaaS, and SaaS, are they growing at the same speed, or would you say that one is sort of slowing down and the other catching up, or do you have any data to see sort of like the trend in the growth here?
Yeah, so good question. So SaaS was the fast grower, and it's still growing, especially sort of outside of the purview of IT in the business units, which is a concern to security because they have to have visibility into these apps. Infrastructure as a service, absolutely a lot of lift and shift activities, moving things out of corporate data centers to cloud data centers. And then PaaS is a little slower because it takes longer, but we're seeing tremendous growth in things like serverless application development, which sort of mirrors your point, is that the attackers, this is new for attackers, but it's new for developers who are getting used to this. And it's also really new for security people. And I should add, back to your question before about staffing, one of the hardest positions to recruit for is a cloud security architect. So the amount of knowledge that an organization may have about not only cloud security, but attacks and vulnerabilities in the cloud can be limited.
And that's completely in line with what we're seeing as well. I mean, I think it's very interesting what you're saying here, that these are completely different sort of business units, right? You have the very DevOps focused PaaS side of the house, and then you have sort of more like the network and sysadmin sort of side for the IaaS, and then for the SaaS stuff, you have down to application owner, and they can even be small different units throughout a large organization. One of the things that I always try to mention when I talk about the security skill shortage that you mentioned as well is that even these cloud security architects, they tend to be very focused on one specific platform as well. So you can be very accredited and familiar with, for example, AWS. But if you have that person and drop them into an organization that relies heavily on Alibaba or GCP, there's going to be, even at that point, a little bit of holes in the security expertise, because these platforms are so incredibly different from one another. So there's really no sort of clear one approach, one size fits all as you move around, right?
Very true. And asking for someone who's an AWS expert, an AWS security expert, oh yeah, and a Google Cloud Platform or an Azure expert as well, that's a tall order.
That's where you get the big money if you're that person.
That's absolutely, call your shots. If you go to the next slide, when we associate attack surface growth, you have to also think about security telemetry growth. And what we see, we talked about the challenges of threat detection and response a couple of slides ago. Well, what people are doing to kind of alleviate that, or at least deal with that, is to collect, process, and analyze more data. So this suggests that 32% collect substantially more data to support cybersecurity analytics and operations than they did 2 years ago, and 44% collect somewhat more data. So 76% collect, process, analyze more data. That's challenging. That's a big challenge. So I'm wondering if you're seeing that too, Marcus.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of reasons people are collecting this data. In some cases, I'd even argue that to a certain degree, there's a lot of duplicated data, especially if you have different security solutions that sort of work off the same telemetry. They tend to have copies of the same thing. So if you want to store that data for a long time, having something that can sort of clean that up and deduplicate it is of course quite valuable, right? From what you've seen, what would you say is the biggest driver for everyone collecting all this data? What is the sort of business case for them being storing all this data?
That's a good question. So generally, there's a thought that if we have the data and we're breached, we'll have coverage. So it's sort of like, the old saying is the network doesn't lie. If you collect and can analyze the network metadata, you can figure out where the attacks come from. Well, it's that plus supplementing the data. The problem is exactly what you say, is kind of making sense of all this data in context and putting a timeline or associating a timeline with it, and matching or contextualizing internal data with threat intelligence. That's where I think we run into problems. So I think the industry is kind of, and security professionals have bought into the more data is better. And to some extent that's true, but I think there are diminishing returns, and I think we're starting to realize that.
Yeah, we're also hearing and seeing a little bit of a price fatigue here as well, right? A lot of security solutions charge by the amount of data, and there's sort of hidden cost as well, especially if you're looking at data that needs to go between different clouds or from cloud to ground and vice versa, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the data has to go somewhere, and while level 3 kind of security analyst wants access to the data and they want retrospective access, so retain it for several years, there's a cost associated with that, and every company that I work with has to weigh those costs.
Yep.
Interesting, if you go to the next slide, this really is an assortment of the data types they collect. And there's a pattern here. It took me a while to figure this out, but the pattern really speaks to the imminent need. And we talked about threat detection and response being more difficult than it was 2 years ago. If you look at pretty much up to malware sandboxes, so security data from endpoints, web security data, threat intelligence feeds, email, log data from security devices, what you've got is the systems that are being compromised, data from the most likely threat vectors, so web and email, data from threat intelligence feeds that I need to kind of pull the IOCs out to compare them to what's going on internally, and then some file detonation stuff to understand, is this file malicious? Is there a hash value associated with it? Is that hash file known in things like VirusTotal? So things like that. Now, I've highlighted public cloud logs and cloud network taps, and that has escalated. So that 18%, I would say, since we did this research, that has grown, and it's going up the stack. But there is a lot of data here, and you can see why the data is increasing, because there's so many sources. So are you seeing the same kind of thing, Marcus, especially with regard to understanding the cloud data?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, with the accelerated adoption as well, all of this data goes up significantly. The interesting sort of takeaway from us as an NDR vendor coming from the network side is that from the get-go, we sort of realized that getting the data isn't necessarily the hard part, right? If you look at virtual cloud taps and things like that, it's going to be across the board. Everyone's going to be able to get a copy of that data. So with the increasing amount of data that's being sent, the sort of differentiator for us and other security products is really what we do with the data once we get it, right? Can we make sense of it, and can we, not alert on a bunch of anomalies to that degree that most security products have done historically, and what sort of you talked about at your first slide, what's causing all of this increased workload from the get-go, the noisiness of all of these security products.
Yeah, and you're spot on here. The name of the game after you've collected this data is who does the best job of analyzing this data. So reduce the noise, get it down to root cause, high fidelity alerts with a very good forensic detailed map in a timeline fashion. That's certainly the holy grail here, and certainly that's what Vectra is focused on.
And I think that's something that comes more and more with these products working together, right, and bringing in different types of telemetry. So for example, if you have that threat intelligence, you can sort of clear the board with the signature-based stuff really quick, but then you can sort of focus on the behavioral detections and the things that actually require more processing and more powerful sort of approaches to detecting these threats, and with the intent, of course, of actually rooting out real attacks as opposed to just anomalous behavior or blips from the norm, if you may. What would you say is the biggest sort of growing data source that you didn't see coming? Like, is there anything here that you're surprised with from all the different stuff that you guys are tracking?
No surprise, but it is the cloud. So it's cloud. So understanding, I mean, a lot of the cloud workloads are temporal. So it's API calls, it's spinning up and excuse me, spinning up and spinning down workloads. It's container based, and that's going to create a lot of data in a very short amount of time. And again, it's understanding that data. What is that data telling me about behavior? Is there a privileged account abuse there? Is there lateral movement of some type of attack? What's normal and what's abnormal behavior? So it's really understanding all of those behaviors as we saw the cloud proliferation accelerates.
Yeah, and I think especially when you talk about cloud, it becomes more identity driven, right? You sort of move away from having access and don't really care about IP addresses and things like that. But you sort of more you need additional context around to understand it and make sense of it, right?
Very true, and that makes it harder. If you go to the next slide, this is interesting too, Marcus. So this is specific. So which of the following security or cybersecurity attacks has your organization actually experienced within the last 12 months? And this is related to your hybrid cloud environment. So you can say zero-day exploits, take advantage of new or previously unknown vulnerabilities. There are a lot of vulnerabilities, and it may be a 0 day to me because I'm not paying attention. Because I don't have the cloud posture management of what's going on, or it may be related to the applications I develop. Exploits to take advantage of known vulnerabilities, that's really kind of a follow-on to the 28%. And then the misuse, this you just spoke to this, the misuse of privileged accounts by inside employees. And it could be, misuse is a good word because it could be malicious, it could be negligence. And I think the important point here is that malware moves laterally. It moves east to west, and which is why looking at the network is so important. But now part of that east-west movement is to the cloud. And so we see things like account takeovers. We see things like exploitation or exfiltration of cloud-based data. And I know your customers are seeing this as well.
Yeah, especially the account takeover is something that we see a lot with our Office 365 detection, especially since most of the preventative sort of approaches to that are always focused on the traditional protect your password sort of thing, right? So you either have your end users use very strong and secure passwords and change them often, or you put in secondary sort of authentication methods like MFA and things like that. But with the attacks that targets that and ultimately lead to an account takeover, we see a more sort of targeted avenue where they get compromised with malicious emails or malware in some sort, and then the attackers steal already authenticated sessions. And at that point, it doesn't really matter if they change their password or have MFA enabled. The attackers can leverage those sessions and just like you said, move laterally and find higher value accounts and continue to pivot from that until they get what they want. So these are traditional things that are incredibly hard to either quench with like a preventative approach, and they're very, very hard to detect as well if you're just looking at sort of the authentication side of the house. You really need to get that incomplete behavior and see an attacker move around both inside the cloud as well as bouncing between the endpoints, the on-prem network, and the cloud. So they can typically, disappear from the view of one security solution because that solution doesn't have that full insight of both the cloud and the on-prem network.
Very true.
So, yeah. So my traditional question here again is this anything that surprised you or anything that's growing in a way that you didn't anticipate when you started to see these numbers?
Just the frequency. So one of the if you go back 5 to 10 years, Marcus, the thought was we can't move our workloads to the cloud; it's not secure. And then we went in 180-degree change. We said, well, the cloud service providers know security and they're building these world-class data centers, so it's going to be more secure. But really, it's the appreciation of that shared security model that keeps changing. So, for instance, API security changed the model because all of a sudden you're making calls within the cloud service provider's environment versus putting a workload there. So where does that responsibility line change? I think that's a challenge for people, and it's reflected in this data.
Yeah, and I can see that's a discussion that's very hard to sort of have with one of these big cloud providers if you're a smaller organization as well, right? And you have had compromised accounts or data like that. You don't really have any recourse calling one of the big guys and saying, hey, this is all your fault. You should have fixed this for me.
And it goes back to, in some cases, goes back to basic hygiene, basic blocking and tackling. So things like S3 buckets, open S3 buckets, that is not the cloud service provider's responsibility. That's just basic hygiene, but there's so many moving parts that sometimes that's not understood, and those accounts are left wide open.
Yeah, and then I mean the traditional attack that everyone is joking about, where API keys are left in open GitHub repositories and what have you, right? It's all
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to uncover here. So if you go to the next slide, and you'll be as disappointed as I am, I think, in this data. So do you feel that you have the necessary tools in place to gain security visibility into your organization's cloud resident workloads? Only 29% say definitely. So only 29%, Marcus, are confident that they do have that visibility to understand the cloud workloads, understand the developer behavior or the privileged account behavior, to understand what's going on with these transient workloads. That's pretty scary to me. And if you think about how dynamic things are in the cloud, you are increasing your risk every day that this is true.
How do you think this sort of gears up towards the more traditional on-prem, very tightly controlled enterprise organization with firewalls and moats and lasers and all that thing?
I mean, the percentage would be much higher because for the most part, people are doing log management or they're using a SIM. They've got some content around their SIM, so they've built some rules, or they're getting these rules or correlations, custom templated correlations from their vendors. So the level of visibility is much higher. It could certainly be better, and we've seen it improve over the last few years, but I'd just say the pace of change with cloud has driven this type of situation. We're playing catch up as security professionals. We're still playing catch up, and that's unacceptable. And I think the business has to come much closer to security. CISOs have to make this a priority and have to measure their progress as a business metric. But I think that's where we are.
I would assume that this ties into a lot of the nature of how people spin up and move their data to the cloud as well. You have the whole problem with shadow IT and small departments signing up and starting to use different applications and things like that. And just like we talked about a couple of slides back, how there's so different business units that are leveraging these different components of the cloud, and as opposed to when you traditionally had new stuff going on inside your regular old network, that would be more of something that had to touch the network team and the security team, and something had to be installed in a traditional way and so forth, right? So I think just the nature of it being such widespread and from different departments adds to this sort of complexity and the what, like you call it, the catch up of the security teams trying to scramble to get their head around this.
Yes, absolutely, and you're right that if business units are making SaaS decisions, that may be outside the purview of IT anyway, and that makes it harder for security to get visibility here. So you're absolutely right. If you go on, this slide says new defenses. These aren't necessarily new, but I'd say what we're seeing is them coming together in a more architectural way. At ESG, we call that SOPA, Security Operations and Analytics Platform Architecture. And others call it the SOC triad, but it's really this combination of network detection and response tools like Vectra, EDR tools, and those are looking at the processes, not only on the endpoints themselves, but on servers and cloud-based workloads. And then SIM is still very popular for investigations and to look at the scope of different attacks. And security operations becomes the action engine. So we collect all this data. Hopefully we have good integration of the data and good analytics across some of the data elements from EDR, NDR, and SIM. And then we've got SOC operations, actually automating processes, instrumenting different tools, orchestrating processes too, and those things come together for response and remediation. So one use case that may be worth talking about here that I know you're very familiar with, Marcus, and it's very timely, is the secure remote worker use case. So what are you seeing there?
Yeah, so this is a big thing that blew up with the current situation and everyone moving to working remotely in a vastly accelerated pace as well, on the same level of the cloud stuff, right? So that sort of changed the world, and especially sort of the aspect of VPNing into your enterprise networks and or using remote desktop protocols and things like that. So that was a very big shift in a very short amount of time. With a lot of organizations are still to a large extent struggling to keep up with that and trying to grasp the security access of that. I think it's good that it happened, maybe not in the uncontrolled manner that it did happen, but I think that organizations, at least the very tech-forward organizations, were already sort of thinking about it in what they usually call the extended enterprise. How traditionally in the olden days, you would have a very fixed workforce coming to a corporate office and then working from one workstation all day, right? But the more modern organizations, there's so much more partners accessing the networks. There's temp workers, contractors, and even tech partners as well. And gives a more transient, sort of loose aspect to who is a part of your organization and what resources do they need, and it of course makes it much more difficult to say that it needs to be a managed device, completely locked down. It needs to be issued from our IT department, and now you're sort of opening up yourself, both on-prem as well as the cloud services, to temporal access and often access from unmanaged devices, or at least unsecure devices. So I think those are things that organizations are still struggling with, but I'm glad that we are pulling that band-aid off and helping accelerate that sort of adoption.
Me too. And one thing I've neglected to talk about was the bullet points on the right side of this slide, which come together in this SOPA architecture. So we're pulling in more cloud telemetry. We are enriching our internal data with threat intelligence. We, as you mentioned several times in this presentation, we have to understand the identity context. So what device, what user, whether the behavior is anomalous or not. And we're adding the advanced analytics. And I think, to me, that's the winners of security operations in the future are the ones who can really make a quantum leap in the analytics scale, the analytics accuracy, and the ability to take action off of those analytics.
And this model, whatever you want to call it, but the combination of these components is something that we're seeing a lot of our customers specifically talk about and ask about even before we are, and almost all of our competitors are leveraging this model as well. So I think at this point it is widely accepted that this is the modern sort of toolkit that a SOC needs to have to be able to manage the amount of data and where the data is today. And I think it specifically makes it incredibly powerful to have these components focus on the specific areas where they know it really well, right? I sometimes simply describe it as EDR takes care of the process level stuff on the devices. NDR is sort of like the eye in the sky that gives you the complete picture of sort of the battlefield, and then SIM sort of manages the application side of the house and any type of telemetry that comes from there. But of course, this is blurring as all of these components are sort of covering a little bit of what the other ones are doing as well. But by having solutions that tightly integrate with each other and play off of each other's strength and even feed to them and work seamlessly between them, this toolkit is incredibly powerful and really helps stressed out SOC teams regaining that visibility and control of what's going on in their environment.
Absolutely, and many large enterprises have these components. Some of them are legacy components that they're replacing. Some are starting from scratch in one area or another. And so I'm often asked the question, Marcus, well, where do I start? And so if you go to the next slide, I think this really is the data-based answer to that question. So the question was, which of the following statements is most accurate when it comes to threat detection at your organization? And you can see the largest piece of the pie, 43% say, my organization tends to use network detection and response tools as a first line of defense for threat detection. And then there's another percentage that uses both NDR and EDR tools for threat detection. But the point is that the network doesn't lie. So that if you, again, I said that before, but if you understand the network metadata, you can analyze it, you will be able to detect things like lateral movement and command and control traffic and anomalous behavior. And it's important to note too that security operations personnel have been using network detection and response tools forever. So it was things like Ethereal or Wireshark or TCP dump, things like that. And over time, those got better and we collected more data. And now we're at a point where we're able to look at that data and do things like analyze campaigns, assuming we have the campaign knowledge, mapping internal, like I say, network traffic with known IOCs, even predictive analysis, understanding behaviors, understanding IOCs, and being able to predict problems. So I know I'm speaking to the expert here, Marcus. This is where Vectra lives. Does this make sense to you?
Yeah, and I mean, this is obviously something we've been touting for a long time as well. What you're saying there, the network doesn't lie. You're always going to have devices on that network that you, for whatever reason, can't immediately monitor. Maybe they don't take an agent, maybe you don't want an agent on them, maybe you don't know about the devices, right? And relying on that sort of side of the house to give you all of those all the data you need is not going to be enough, right? So looking at what transactions happen on the network, which is something that is completely seamless as well, it's very hard or impossible for an attacker to see who's looking at that traffic, right? You can always try and circumvent specific inline policies and things like that, but just having someone that looks at all the transactions on the network, be it your cloud network or your SaaS applications per se, or even the on-prem network, you can't really you can't really do anything as an attacker with that. You're just going to hope that you don't get caught.
Very true. So if you go on to the next slide, it's my summary slide, just kind of concluding what we talked about. So the old way isn't working, and it won't work. It doesn't scale. It's too labor intensive. We depend on too many tools. There are too many data sources. We don't have enough people. They're just a death by 1,000 cuts kind of reasons why it doesn't work and it won't work. So we have the requirement, new demands for scale, coordination, and cloud support. And it's important to recognize that the SOC team needs help. So they need advanced analytics, they need automation or automated solutions, and sometimes they need professional services or managed services too. And then the SOAP architecture or the SOC triad, SIM, EDR, and NDR work better together, but that assumes that there's tight integration, that you can produce these high fidelity alerts, so reduce the noise. And we want the forensic details. So we want the alerts to not only tell us something's wrong, but give us the breadcrumb trail of why things are wrong, so that we can then do the human investigations when we need to, or have confidence to automate processes for remediation. So what did I miss here, Marcus?
No, I think you wrapped it up pretty neatly. I mean, this is really what we're seeing, and we're seeing real proof that this is the way forward, and it really works and helps for our customers that implement it, especially it together. Just reducing that workload, and I think if I were to summarize it in one sentence, I think that being able to piece the puzzle together and sort of doing the work of the analysts before they have to do it themselves is the way forward, and leveraging this tech to make life as simple as possible, as opposed to raising a bunch of alerts and stressing them out with that increased amount of data. That's really what I think we're aiming and we're striving to help out and have so far incredibly successfully with our product.
Yes, let the machines do what they're good at, let the people do what they're good at, and find the synergy there. Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening today. I'm Jon Oltsik, again, Senior Principal Analyst and Fellow at ESG. Marcus, thanks so much for playing along. Thank you so much for taking the time, Jon. This is incredibly interesting for me, and I hope very valuable for the people who listen in. I'd like to add a little piece of
piece of collateral here at the very end. If this is something that you, the listener, thought was very interesting, we have a very good white paper that we put together on that subject called Threat Detection and Response in Cloud Environments. It's available through our webpage, and this deck will be circulated to you as well. That's a very good read to get some additional, a little bit more technical insight into how these tech components come together, and specifically how NDR can help with your cloud environment and securing that. And we also have a very interesting discussion between our CEO and one of the distinguished investors in our company, and they're talking about if the cloud is safe and how you can reduce your business risk while securing the cloud. And that's something I highly recommend you guys go listen to as well. It's a really, really interesting discussion. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to us today, and hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.